first of all, just start by kind of tell us about your life in New York and what was going on before, before the Japanese
Oh,
attacked Pearl Harbor. What was your life like? Where did you live?
well,
Those kind of things.
I lived in Waterville, New York, and went to Waterville schools, and my my brother had joined the Navy after he graduated from high school. He couldn't find a job, so he decided to join the Navy. And I guess that kind of got me in the idea that I might want to get into the Navy also. He warned me that when they have people check your teeth as dentists, they are not dentists. They're nothing but corpsmen. And he says, if I were you, he says, I'd go to the nearest dentist and get all your teeth fixed before you get into the service. So that's what I did, and I was in the service almost 3 years and never had any dental work at all.
Talk about kind of your family, and you had met a young lady. And when exactly did you go to enlist in the Navy? When exactly was that?
Well, I was right around July 4th of 1943. I wanted to join the Navy then, and of course I went to the recruiting office, and they advised me that I couldn't get into the Navy unless I had one of my parents sign for you. So I had talked to my mother, and she wouldn't sign. She had no way. But talked to my father, and he signed, and that's how I got in. So actually, I joined the Navy on July 7th, 1943.
And how long was it? How much? So what? You had some. Did you have some training for a while? When did you get to be on the Arkansas?
Well, actually, right after we got out of boot camp, they had all the recruits in an area decide some of them wanted to go to different schools, and we were waiting to see if you could get accepted or not. So at that time, they just about the whole company that I was with in Sampson, New York, at our boot training, were put on the Arkansas at the same time. That was in, I think, September of 43.
Now, when you got before we get too far, Arkansas was going. You had met a young lady before you enlisted. Is that correct?
Oh yeah, yeah. I met Alice Davis. Her mother worked in the bakery where I was working, and I got to meet her. They had a union meeting, and all the members of the bakery were there, and Alice's mother brought Alice and I met her at that time.
So when you got to the Arkansas in September of 1943, what kind of things was what was the Arkansas involved with at that time?
At that time, they had just been changed over from what they call the White Fleet, where they would be training midshipmen on the operation of a battleship.
And did you head to Northern Ireland shortly after you got on the Arkansas? Did you guys go over there for a while to Northern Ireland?
Yeah, we shortly after I got on the Arkansas, we were left New York for Belfast, Northern Ireland, and because we were escorting a convoy, it took us 10 days to cross the ocean. Naturally, because you just don't travel in a straight line trying to avoid submarines that might be in the area.
Now, as you were on the Arkansas, what were your duties, and what did you learn, and what did you train to do?
Well, when I first got on the Arkansas, I was a deckhand and just doing normal deck duties. But then I talked to the officer in charge of the 4th Division, and I was able to, what they call, strike for a gunner's mate position. So I was then assigned to Turret 4, along with, I think at that time there were 9 other men in there. Some of them were already rated, but the last few, myself and 2 or 3 more, all working to become gunner's mate 3rd class.
And as we're talking in September of 1944, you were how old?
Well, I'd have been 18. And,
18
yeah,
years old.
Yeah.
So pretty young for these
Yeah.
for these kind of things. So, working at the turret, how did you train, and what kind of things did you do to learn what it was going to take to be a part of this situation with the turret?
Well, there was I got real close to a 2nd class gunner's mate, and he was the one that kind of showed me around and warned me of the dangers of the. I mean, we had what they call not buckets, but like barrels of water located all around the turret, because if you got a powder bag that broke, you could dunk it into the water rather than let it where it could explode.
Talk a little bit about the process of what did it take for you 10 gentlemen to get a shell into the guns to fire the guns. What was the process to make that happen? What had to happen?
Well, the shells were located in the bottom of the ship, and along with the powder, and you had conveyors that would move it up into the turret at different levels. My first assignment in the general quarters was powder passage, where we would take 90-pound bags of powder that come up on a conveyor, and then we would take 4 of them and put them in a box above our head. It opens to the side. You put 4 of them in, close it, and then that would be right under the breech of the gun, and they opened it up from the top then to get the powder out. But they used 4 bags of powder for one shot.
And how heavy were these bags and the shells that you guys?
Well, The projectiles weighed 845 pounds. That were what they call bombardment shells. And you'd put a fuse on the end of it, so that it would explode upon contact. And our range of firing was probably 12 miles. We could be pretty accurate within that lane, and that's what we did. We would fire ahead of the army that was moving up, and just as soon as you got to a point where we couldn't fire too much ahead of them, then we'd have to quit, because otherwise you'd be dropping the shells right on your own people.
So a couple months before D-Day, and I might mention that we're talking 75 years to the day after you were at Normandy. We're talking on June 6th, 2019, 75 years later. In April, a couple months before, a month and a half before D-Day, you went over to Northern Ireland and did some practicing. How did that go? What was the purpose of that trip?
Well, actually, we went there. We were delivering a convoy, and the transport of the more troops along with equipment for the army. But our part in there was to support the landing, so we would we'd work along those lines.
At what point in time did you know? When did you kind of know what was coming up? When did you know that you were going to be heading somewhere to support troops landing in Europe?
Yeah.
When did you know, or how much did you know?
Well, we knew when we were in, I think, Portsmouth, England, that we were going to be part of a major assault on the French coast. But other than that, I don't think we knew anything. And we would, in fact, because of the weather, they postponed the original landing one day. So we left England and headed for the beaches of France, and then turn around and come back, because they had determined that the weather just wouldn't permit the landings. We at that time, like I said, we're still all a bunch of kids, mostly 17 and 18-year-olds. So you're not too serious about most of that stuff. So we would keep ourselves busy by getting poker games going, killing time waiting for us to arrive at the location.
So, so you headed toward Normandy Beach sometime during the evening of June 5th or the night before? Yes. You headed that way. What were your thoughts as you did you have any idea what you were going to see, or what were your thoughts?
No, actually, I don't think we had any idea what other than we knew that what our duty was going to be is to support the troops that were landing, and but I had no idea that we were going to drop anchor so close to shore and just sit there like a sitting duck. But that's the way it was, and we were, fortunately, by the time D-Day came, the Allied air forces had pretty much contained the Germans' air force, and we had very little activity from the Germans. The first night that we were in Normandy, after firing our guns all day long, a German bomber came over and dropped the bomb, but he wasn't very good at what he was doing, and it was probably maybe 50 feet or more away from the ship, but it didn't damage the ship. Other than the fact you could hear the flak of the thing exploding, hitting the side of the ship afterwards.
Right, and the Arkansas had been around since World War I guess, and had quite a bit of armor to protect itself, I guess. Did you know much about that?
Yeah, well, actually, what they did is they put on the outside of the hull of the ship, they put what they call a blister, and it was a added shell all around the ship. And one of the jobs that when I first got onto the Arkansas was to clean the deck. I mean, the deck was wood on top of steel, and it was all painted. And what we were assigned to do is to holy stone the deck, which is you take a brick like a fire brick and a mop handle, and you'd hold that and force it down, and you'd have sand and water and actually like more like sandpaper, trying to get the paint off of the, because of the thought of with painted wood would go up like tinder if it was hit at all. So they wanted to try to make the ship as safe as they could.
So let's talk about D-Day itself, 75 years ago. Today, you dropped anchor, and you were about, they say, about 4,000 yards away. So about 40 football fields, if that helps
Right.
people. So again, you were very close to the shore, and you could see everything that was going on. And of course, you were at Omaha Beach
Right.
that morning. So talk about, you know, it's very early in the morning, the sun probably just coming up. Talk about, you know, what you and your crew did to get things started.
Well, it was about, I think we arrived at the point of dropping anchor about 6 o'clock in the morning. They dropped anchor, and then as soon as the ship settled after dropping the anchor, we started firing our 12-inch guns. And we fired our guns all day long till dusk, and then we'd secure the main battery, and then we would, most of our crew would be assigned to a quad 40mm anti-aircraft gun, and we stand watch on that the rest of the night. So you didn't get a whole lot of sleep.
So, if you can remember, talk about as you were, what was you and the other crew of gentlemen? What was the process then to, what was your job and what had to happen as you shot shells toward the beach at Omaha? What was your job and how did that happen?
Well, at that time I was what they call a rammerman, and my job was to put a fuse on the end of the projectile and then wrestle it over to the loading tray, push it over onto the tray, and then with the rammer you ram it into the breech of the gun.
And how many shells in an hour? How long did it take you to get one shell and fire it, and then get the next shell? How long did it take to do that?
It's only a matter of a few minutes, because most of the shells you had moved over with the chain hoist over to the firing deck, and they were readily available. It's just a matter of putting a fuse on them and wrestle and put them onto the tray, and then to ram into the breech of the gun.
From where you were in the turret, could you see what was going on in the beach at all?
No. Yeah, that's the problem with being assigned in a turret. You don't see much at all what's going on, unless you're the trainer. If you're a trainer, you would have a periscope you could see. But other than that, you don't know what's happening.
When your time, from what you could tell and what people had mentioned and told you, what was the German resistance like toward you? Were they shooting? You were again 4,000 yards away. Were they firing any, shells at you? Or were there, what were they trying to do to stop you from shooting shells at them?
Actually, they weren't firing too much at the ship, because they didn't have the size guns that would really damage it, and they'd be wasting their time. What their main objective was to try to stop the landing craft from getting into the beach.
Whoops.
When your dusk had fallen and you had time to get away from the turret, what were you able to kind of get a feel for what was going on in the big picture, or were you able to see what was going on in the beach and things like that?
No, by the time we quit firing, it was getting dark, and we wouldn't see what was going on. Thank you.
I can see.
So, so how many days then? So you fired all these shells. How did you know? How were you able to kind of tell? You didn't want to shoot these shells and hit any Americans, of course. How did you figure out where to fire so you would just hit German forces and not
Well,
Americans?
we had two planes aboard our ship, and the planes were out doing the spotting, and just as soon as they thought that we had reached the limit of our range, they let us know, and then we quit firing.
So, how long were you anchored 4,000 yards away from the beach, and how many days did you continue to fire ammunition at the Germans at Omaha Beach?
Well, right now I couldn't guess at the days we did fire, but we were there for I think 10 days. But by that time we had reached the limit of our range, and
Do you kind of remember how you felt? Were you excited? Were you scared? How were you feeling as you were a part of this, one of the biggest landings, in basically world history? How were you feeling, as you kind of did all this work? What were your feelings at that point?
well, I thought that I finally had my expectations realized, because I just from the time that Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, I couldn't wait to try to get to a point where I felt I could do something to counteract that. And
This was the time.
I think it was time. I said, well, we finally got to that point, and I think it kind of satisfied my hopes.
And I know you had a different job later, so you know more about it. But the shells that you were shooting, what was going to be the result if that shell fell within? Let's say there were 50 Germans nearby. What would the result when that shell exploded? What would happen roughly?
Well, actually, that's how we were knocking out the machine gun nests that were pinning down the army. We'd either have a direct hit on one of them, or get it close enough so that it would knock that machine gun nest out of commission. But that's
so. After a few days, at about a week or so, approximately, you left. Your ship left Normandy, and you remember, I think you stayed in France, and then you headed over to Cherbourg. What do you remember about your time in Cherbourg, France. What were you guys doing over there?
Yeah. Well, they had assigned a number of battleships to travel to the bay in Cherbourg, and they had I think it was the Nevada, the Tennessee, and New York, and Texas, and Arkansas were all lined up one behind the other, and we were steamed into the bay. And as we reached a certain point, you would turn your guns onto the beach and fire. And at that point, they were actually the French guns that the Germans had taken over on that beach, and they were using them. They were like, it was actually something similar to a turret on the ship, because they had a train to shoot at the army who was trying to advance to take the location, and then when all these ships came, the Germans thought that this was going to be another landing, so they were hurrying up, and they swung their guns around and began firing at the ships that were coming in, and they did hit several ships, but not the Arkansas. I don't know why, but we lucked out. But that's how they finally took that location. They trained their guns around to fire at the Navy, and while they were doing that, the Army came up behind them and took them.
Right. So this Cherbourg was taken in a very short time. You
Right.
were not there very long,
No.
because, as you mentioned, the Army had come from behind them, and they had no defense because the guns were firing at you. And how close would you say their coastal guns got to hitting your ship? As you said, the Arkansas kind of led a blessed life. As
Yes.
far as how close did you feel like these shells were hitting near your ship?
Well, I expected what happened was they were picking out certain ships to shoot at, because, like I said, there was about 6 or more battleships that were all in a line coming into the bay, and they had to decide what target they were going to. But for some reason, they didn't bother with us. But I don't think we had any shells that came closer than 50 or 100 feet from where we were.
So after you left Cherbourg, where did you head next? And you were a part of, I guess it's called Operation Dragoon. Do you remember much about that?
Yes, we. That's the invasion of southern France, and our assignment there was to support the troops landing there, and that's what we did. And after that, the firing at the southern France, our main battery guns were worn out. A lot of people don't understand that the big guns like 12 or 16-inch guns, they have a rifling that's dropped in, and it's all done with heat and expansion, and as you start firing, as that rifling heats up, it starts to move out. And when it gets about 8 or 10 inches outside the barrel of the gun, then you take a hacksaw and cut it off. But by then, your accuracy is not too good anymore because you're losing your rifling, and the shells coming out are wobbling. I mean, it's the same way with a pistol or a rifle or anything else. You got that rifling in there, and that's what controls the accuracy of that bullet. So after our
So, as you mentioned, then after you left southern France, I guess you went back to Boston. I guess, is that right?
Yeah.
And you had some refitting for a month or two. Is that right?
Yes, not immediately. I think we went to Scotland or somewhere first, but then we were sent to Boston for a refitting. And what they did in the Boston Navy Yard was put new guns in the 6 turrets. So we were in the Boston Navy Yard for quite a while. But then after that, we were assigned to the Pacific.
Right. And you had before you went back to Boston, you had actually gone through the Panama Canal.
Yeah.
Do you remember going through the Panama Canal?
Yeah, I sure do, because when we got into what they call a freshwater lake, our steering gear went out, and we had to have the all the seamen in the area go to the lower deck and try to steer the ship by hand. So it took us longer to get through the Panama Canal than anybody else because we had that breakdown.
So we're in early February 1945. Talk about your preparation. You're headed now. Where are you headed now? You're headed toward Japan. What do you know, and what's going on? And has your role changed? By 1945, are you doing something different now that you were doing before?
Yeah, I was. Now I was a gunner's mate 3rd class, and my general quarters duty now would be the trainer of Turret 4, and that it would be my job to take care of that. And just for a matter of information, how much room there is in a turret. We had Army people come on board and tour the ship, and they said they had more room in the tank than what we had in the. There was 2 of us in the training booth. I was the trainer, and then you'd have a sight setter. And sometimes they allow you to fire by sight, but you have that periscope.
Yeah, and so as a trainer, exactly as you're heading toward Iwo Jima, what exactly would a trainer do as you fired the shells? What was your job now as the trainer?
Well, my main job was, as far as daily duties, was to take care of the upper shell room, and that didn't change. I still had to do that. You oil the motors and all that kind of stuff, but it's general maintenance.
So you get to Iwo Jima on the morning of February 16th, 1945. So what happens? What goes on at Iwo Jima? What are you up against? Who's trying to hurt you? How successful? Tell us about Iwo Jima. What goes on there?
Well, before we get there, we had a gunner's mate, second class, on the ship that seemed to. He must have been following the movement of the various groups moving from one island to another to get to closer to Japan, and he told us. He said, "We're going to Iwo Jima." I never even heard of it, but I don't know how he knew. But we arrived at Iwo Jima and began shelling the beach and the what is it, Mount Suribachi, and the Japanese were more or less embedded in that, and as they had all these like caves that they were in, and made it difficult for the Marines to get them. But I think we arrived at least 3 or 4 days before the landing, and we began shelling Mount Suribachi, and we had a plane spotter to try to pick out some targets for us to turn our guns on, and we were hoping that we had softened up the landing, but it still wasn't an easy chore for the Marines when they hit the beach. They still are under fire from all kind of machine guns and that.
What kind of resistance was coming from the Japanese? Were they firing shells at you? Were you far enough away they couldn't get to you? Were there any kamikaze planes at this point trying to hit the ship?
We had several incidents where they had reported that there were a number of kamikazes headed our way, and that's what would where they would try to decommission our ship to quit firing, but we lucked out again. I mean, our ship never got hit by a kamikaze, although we had I think our ship was credited with shooting down at least 4 or 5 Japanese planes during those raids.
So, as the trainer, as you were in Iwo Jima, were you able? So, you would help them point the guns, and then when the shells hit, you could see the result of what happened. Then, is that right?
I could if I was looking out of the periscope, but normally you wouldn't see anything. Although at one point in time, they picked out a target on the beach, and then they give you a direction. You line up, and we were firing from a distance where you could actually see the target, and then see where the shells hit.
And see the result of the
Yeah.
Japanese being hit by the shell. when we had chat before, I had asked you this question, and I'll ask it again. As you were firing at these Japanese folks and realizing that these shells are causing obviously some fatalities of the Japanese, did you ever pause and think about what was your thought about, these are Japanese folks that they have mothers and children and wives back in Japan? Did you ever think like, what were your thoughts as you were causing this mortal damage to some of these Japanese and Germans?
No, I think at that point it's a point of, well, you get them or they'll get you. Survival. And
so there really wasn't not really a thought about that at all?
No.
And you were only 18.
So, so you spent 2 or 3 days in Iwo Jima. What kind of led you to leave and move on? Did you feel like you had done what you could do there? The shells were the army was far enough. What brought you to be done at Iwo Jima?
Well, like I said, I think we were about 3 days ahead of the landing, so we would cruise up and down in front of the island, firing our guns at Mount Suribachi, because we knew that's where all the machine gun nests were, and we.
So when you were done at Iwo Jima, after a period of time, you headed for kind of your last engagement, so to speak, in World War II, which was I guess a long engagement. Talk about, now you're heading to Okinawa.
Okinawa.
Yeah. Talk about heading there, and
well,
what kind of things were going on there.
Well, that was a much bigger island than what Iwo Jima was, and it would be a lot more. It would be difficult to feel that we finally secured it, but I think we arrived there ahead of the landing people, and we fired our guns and rode up and down the beach, but that's when we were come under the more of these kamikazes. At one point they said there were 70 kamikazes headed our way, and that we got all of our anti-aircraft people ready to start shooting, and like I said, they've got credit for shooting down, I think, 4 or 5 Japanese planes. But the real group that contained the kamikaze were the destroyers. They had what they call 5-inch 38 guns, and they used semi-fixed ammunition, and they could put those shells out pretty quickly, and they were accurate. They would first they would try to keep the kamikazes from getting close to where the larger ships were, because a larger ship like a battleship or aircraft carriers, it seems like it's a sitting duck for some of those planes. But we were we were fortunate. They never hit the Arkansas.
Yeah, somebody was looking out for you
Yeah.
for sure. At Okinawa, what kind of what were your targets, and was it similar to Iwo Jima? Were the Japanese embedded anywhere, or how? And what were they trying to do back towards you? And you were there in Okinawa for a long period of time.
Right.
So where were you trying to aim, and what were the resistance at that point?
Well, I think it was the same way. We had our planes out, and they would spot, and they'd pick out a target, and then they radio back to the ship, and then they'd coordinate and get a line on the target, and then we'd fire, and you'd fire a salvo, and usually what happened, you'd fire one salvo and one side, and the second salvo on the other side, and then the next one you're down the middle, and you got them then. But that's the way they generally did it.
So after a month in Okinawa, you had some other, you went to some other different places, but it wasn't too long after that. Talk about where were you and what were you doing? What was the ship doing when you got the news that the World War II was over? Do you remember what your thoughts were, or where were you, or how did you find out?
Well, I think that they put out a daily paper, and they would kind of bring everybody up to date as to what was going on, because otherwise you didn't know. I mean, it's not like things were in these later days. I mean, we didn't have cell phones where you could talk back and forth to your loved ones and all that kind of stuff. The only contact you had was by mail, and that was take a long time, because they never knew where we were going to be when the mail ship was trying to make a delivery. But it was a totally different time. But
When we chatted yesterday, you and your girlfriend at the time was writing letters, and you were writing letters. How many letters do you think you traded back and forth for those years?
well, I think we had a small suitcase full of letters. I mean, but we both try to write every day, and that would add up after a while.
And we'll follow up in just a second. So after the war was over, were you a part of? I know that the ship brought some soldiers back.
Right.
Were you a part of that? I guess it's called Operation Magic Carpet or something. Were you a part of bringing some of the boys back from overseas?
Yeah. Only one trip while I was on the ship, because after we left Okinawa and headed for the States, that was my last trip, because we got into Washington, and at that point I was transferred off the ship.
So before we get away from D-Day, looking back 75 years, if we could go back 75 years to the day, you'd be in the midst of 75 years ago today. You were in the midst of firing shells at Normandy. what are your thoughts of historically? How do you feel about that time and making a difference in the world?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think you felt that you finally accomplished what you came out to do, or at least part of it. I mean, naturally, one person can't do it all, but everybody has their job to do, and I as a veteran of World War II, I feel lucky because I was never wounded, but I feel sorry for those Army and Marine people who were on the ground during those days that we were doing this firing, because they were subject to machine gun fire and small arm fire all the time, and where like I say, if you're on the ship, you're kind of immune to all that stuff, but that's, you had to figure that was your job, so you did it the best way you knew how.
Talk a little bit about so your time now. You've left the Arkansas, and this is over 70 years. 70 years ago. So, update us about what happened to the girl that wrote you all the letters, and give us an overview of your life after the Army. Where did you live? What happened to you since then?
Well, after the war was over, and we, like I say, we landed in Washington, and I was transferred off the ship at that time, and given a 30-day leave, and I traveled by train back to Albany, New York, and then on to Watervliet, and from there, after 30-day leave, I had a report to New York, and I was assigned to the battleship New York. And on that battleship, I was also assigned, because I was rated, I was assigned to shore patrol duty, and a lot of times you just wind up in a police station waiting for a call where there's some rumbling somewhere, so you'd all go out and try to break it up. But of course, I don't know if I should say it, but what happened, as a member of the shore patrol, I could move about. I could hop on a train and travel from New York to Albany without a regular pass or anything else, and that's what I did. I got a lot of one night leave because I come back. I got to hop on the train and come home, and
at some point, you left the Navy and talk about. So what did you do after the armed force? What did you do after the Navy, and what happened to the girl that wrote you all the letters?
Yeah. Well, she waited for me, so we got together, and but before we decided to get married, I had, when I was 17, I quit high school in the third year. So I had it made up my mind that I was going to complete my high school education. So I went back to school full time. And on the day that I was supposed to receive my diploma at the school, I was on my way to Niagara Falls with my wife. We had gotten married, and rather than go to the graduation, we went to Niagara Falls.